Hay Festival.
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 Bienvenidos al podcast Hay Festival 2025, un espacio para imaginar otro mundo.
Bienvenidos al podcast 2025, la edición especial del podcast del Hay Festival en español, en la que celebramos el 20º aniversario de nuestro festival en Cartagena de Indias. Yo soy Catalina Gómez Ángel.
Y yo, Iñaki Lasa de Tura. Para celebrar este momento único para nosotros, le pedimos a nuestros seguidores que nos enviaran las preguntas que consideraban eran claves para entender el mundo en el que vivimos.
Después de un largo ejercicio, nuestro equipo ha seleccionado las 20 preguntas más significativas y para responderlas reunimos a algunas de las mentes más brillantes y más expertas en cada tema que participaron en la reciente edición del Festival de Cartagena en enero del 2025. Empecemos, Iñaki.
Estamos con Peter Frankopan, profesor de Historia Global en la Universidad de Oxford y catedrático UNESCO sobre la ruta de la seda. La BBC lo nombró como un rockstar académico. Con aclamados libros como The Silk Roads, su última obra, La Tierra Transformada, el mundo desde el principio de los tiempos, ha sido elogiada por su vasto y erudito análisis de cómo el medio ambiente ha moldeado la historia global.
Welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for being with us this beautiful afternoon in Cartagena.
Catalina, beautiful afternoon, beautiful city, beautiful country, beautiful people. I'm so lucky to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And this is our questions from our readers. And the first one is, what can cities can learn from rural areas and vice versa?
It's a great question, partly because the answer for most of history is nothing. People in cities don't really pay any attention to the countryside. They don't think about where food comes from, about how to kill a cow or create leather. It just arrives in the shops. So normally we think of people who are clever. They work in universities, they work as lawyers, they work in big buildings. And people who are farmers we think of as being, maybe they don't need to study so hard. But food is the fundamental part of our world. We don't teach children that in schools. We don't teach children how to grow a potato or how to purify water. And so we should learn everything from the countryside. I think even the word civilization, most of us think civilization is something, the top way in which we can explore our cultures. Civilization means the history of cities. And when we think about the connection with not just the countryside, but nomadic peoples, indigenous peoples, the ways we have our formula of thinking about the world is very exclusive. So for us, we need to learn a lot from natural practices. So for example, I was in Medellin yesterday. Medellin has planted trees the last 4 or 5 years that changed the temperature of the city, lowered it by 2 degrees centigrade. Huge amount of energy saving, made it much more sustainable by understanding that a city, although we think of roads and of electricity and of highways and networks, understanding the natural world is crucial, but we don't spend enough time thinking about that.
Peter, how can we change the existing narratives to address the climate emergency?
That's not so hard. Education. You can change a narrative if you spend time to explain why what we have thought of in the past maybe it's not wrong, that's quite aggressive, but maybe there are different ways of thinking. So, for example, my own work on Las Rutas de la Seda explains that the connections between regions, peoples, cultures has been hugely important. So, for example, here in Colombia, it's amazing. Of course, the name of the country has a connection to Europe, but I travel around here, you see Armenia, Antioquia. These are cities in Syria. It's a place in Eastern Asia Minor. These connections from the past are crucial. So if you explain to people how connections have worked, how Mexico and Acapulco were completely central, and the silver, of course, coming from Potosí in Bolivia, were completely central to the economy of China 500 years ago, then I think you can explain the narrative that people can understand. And I think it's the same thing with things like global warming or climate change. You don't need to tell everybody they're wrong. You explain why this matters. You explain how things have changed in the past. Narratives is the job of historians to explain things. And it's amazing, a festival like this in Cartagena, you have some wonderful historians, not just this year, but every year. And the whole point of literature is to have a narrative. Fiction, non-fiction, history. So I think there are ways this can be done, but it requires people to want to listen. And that's a difficult thing to do. That's why festivals like this are so important.
How can we highlight, in this case that you are talking about narrative? Because we have usually one narrative or the predominant narrative, but how can we highlight and learn from this non-hegemonic narrative? Because when you talk about the Silk Roads, I mean, you find these amazing countries. I live in Iran. Then you can understand how they have been dealing with climate change, with the deserts, with the forest. How can we have learned just from all this narrative?
Catalina, when I was at school, I didn't hear a single word about women. I didn't hear a single word about anybody outside Europe. No one told me anything about the history of China. People listening to this podcast, not just in Colombia, all over the world, will be some of the most interested people in history anywhere on the planet. They'll be educated, not educated. They're listening because they want to learn. Most people can't name for me one single film star in the Middle East. They can't name me one pop star in India, one famous writer from China. Billions of people, their history disappears. So these narratives, they change by having to be open-minded, but also sometimes people provoking you to think there is more to learn about the ways, about how we understand the world around us. And in fact, one of the things I'm most proud of in my work is that now everybody wants to think about connections, or it's easier to think about connections because if you explain these links between regions, it's important. So there are many people who've been before me writing about links or about the roles of women or indigenous cultures. This has changed. So today at school, children do learn about women's history. They do learn about parts of Asia. Is there more they can learn? 100%. Could they learn about Africa? Could they learn about different parts of the world, different religions, different ways of cooking, different ways of eating? Of course. But you have to start somewhere. So our world feels more inclusive today, but it takes skill, expertise. You have to learn different cultures, different languages. You need to communicate well. And if you're really lucky, you get an invitation to come to Cartagena to share your knowledge. And hopefully that's what not just me, every speaker is doing here, is trying to provide their perspective. An audience member or someone listening to the podcast decides, yes, I like that, or I don't like it, but it has a reaction. And that's what makes us special as a species, because we're able to listen and to make decisions for ourselves.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to ask you something very quickly. Do you think social media help us to look the world in a bigger spectrum or in a smaller spectrum?
I want to know what you think, Catalina.
Smaller, probably. But at the same time, it allows me, for example, as a reader of news and what is going on, to have a lot of ideas what is going on around the world. But of course, it's my own interest, and I think it depends on you.
I think there are two answers. One is if you open a newspaper here in Colombia today, I promise you it will be filled with news about Donald Trump. Only about Washington and the United States, maybe something about Europe and Russia. There'll be not one word about most of Africa, not one word about Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. That's 1 billion people, just those 4 countries. So I think that 100 years ago, in some ways, people were better informed, but they were rich people. Today, we're much more democratic. You can listen to anything more or less for free. So last year in Peru, there were 150 million downloads of South Korean music, right? So you have 100 million downloads of South Korean music in Turkey. And that means that young people are able to explore more or less for free. They can find anything out. Sometimes it's wrong when they look online, but they're able to use their imagination. So your real question is, are we more curious today than we were 100 years ago? And it doesn't matter what I would say. I'll tell you what my students say, and I'll tell you what my children say. They say our generation is much more interested in the world than yours was. So, and it's very hard for me to disagree with them. I'm not going to tell them they're wrong. They think that their way that they can travel, that they can come to Colombia, they get on a bus, like my son did last year, travel around the whole country, is something I couldn't do 30, 40 years ago because travel was expensive, visas were impossible, parts of countries were hard to get to. So these young people are the future. They're brilliant. They're very engaged, very open-minded. Old people like me say that the world is changing, it's all getting worse. But young people don't say that, they say it's getting better.
And I would like to go back to the first topic about climate impact again.
Yes.
How can we reconcile the extraction of raw materials with the climate impact?
So this is one area where young people are very angry. And it's not surprising that you see on the streets the protests, the demonstrations about environmental movements, about global warming and resource exploitation are led by young people. I think that we overexploit it. It doesn't need me to tell you that on a podcast. We can measure this. So we know at the moment, according to a British government report produced 2 years ago, we currently use 1.6 times the world's resources available every year. And like borrowing too much money from the bank or from a friend or from someone you don't know, if you can't pay your debts, then there are problems. So we are massively overexploiting. So there are three different solutions. The first one is, how do we stop exploitation altogether? Is that even possible? Probably no. So the second solution is, how do we do what we do in a way that is more sustainable? And the third one is, what tools do we have to use what we have better, more efficiently? And there, with things like sciences and new technologies, there are lots of different ways in which there are some really important improvements. So today, for example, in agriculture, some tractors are being produced in the United States with 36 cameras that distinguish between weed and crop in split seconds. And the ways in which we can make our natural resources go further, we can be more creative. But there's no question that the way we're living today is changing the world around us. And I know that because today, here in Cartagena, I looked this morning at the air quality and the particulates that everybody's breathing in, you and me and Catalina, when we're recording this, it's 3 times above the level considered safe by the World Health Organization. So if you tell people, look, the way you're living, it's not just bad for people in other parts of the world where it's very polluted. Here in this beautiful city, how do we find a way to make our own environment better and cleaner? Because that affects us. It makes our lives shorter. So finding ways to have better regulation, better transparency, better efficiencies, find the way in which government can incentivize business, innovation, science, and citizens to behave in a better way. But it's not that hard to do. Societies of the past worked out how to achieve that balance, because if you get it wrong, cities die.
And just for finishing, because the time is getting over, but one of the questions of our readers are very important, and I want to listen to your opinion. Are we witnessing the end of the single Western narrative?
I don't know what that Western narrative ever meant. I think what it meant, when most people say that, is a world where we were democratic, we were free, we believed in tolerance. And is that changing? But when you say Western narrative to me, Catalina, I think also of the Holocaust in the Second World War. I think of the persecution of peoples in the Americas. I think about the terrible wars that have been fought. So that Western narrative, we pick the best bits. We pick Mozart, we pick cathedrals, we pick art, we pick Van Gogh, we pick all the things we're proud of, and we forget about the things that we think are negative. If you go to Iran or to China or to India, that Western narrative never existed in the first place. So I think that what we are good at in the West is that when we make mistakes, we can correct them. That is the single most important thing about democracy. If you have leaders who make mistakes, you can vote for somebody else to come in. In other parts of the world where you have autocracies, you're stuck with a leader forever. Sometimes an autocrat can make good decisions, but sometimes they make bad ones. So are we in danger? I think we have to have faith. Even if at the moment we look around the world and there are lots of leaders in democratic states, we can't even understand how they've been elected. We have to have confidence that our system works. And I promise you, because I spend time in parts of the world that people don't have the freedom to choose their leaders. Belarus, Russia, Iran, many parts of Central Asia, China, South Asia, we should be very grateful to be able to come and do a podcast. And I can say whatever I like. People might agree with me, disagree with me. In many parts of the world, it doesn't work that way. So I think that Western narrative has good bits, has bad bits. We shouldn't beat ourselves up too much. We should protect the bits that are important. We should be honest about the things we've done wrong. But we should be proud of who we are. Be proud to be Colombiano. Maybe I will become one day, because I love this country. But I think sometimes today we think that the West is dying. I mean, for what it's worth, my final comment: if you travel to Shanghai or to Delhi or to Tehran or to Nairobi, I promise you, everybody knows who Taylor Swift is. Everybody knows who David Beckham, Lionel Messi is, right? Everybody knows who Tom Cruise is. Everybody's heard of Shakespeare. Maybe even some of them heard of Peter Frankopan. But if you travel to any of these cities and you say, who are the most important figures from China, from India, from the Middle East, from Africa, they will not even give you a name, let alone a choice of 1 or 2 or 3. So that West, lots of things we do well, but we need to protect those.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter Frankopan, for being part of this special edition of the podcast. Gracias, Peter Frankopan, por esta edición especial del podcast Hay Festival en español. Imaginemos otro mundo.
If you came to the end of the podcast and can still hear me, please, I beg you, ask the organizers of the Hay Festival to invite me again. And I will keep writing books, trying to say something new, something original, so that I can come back to your beautiful city.
Gracias por acompañarnos. Una producción de Ojo por Ojo Multimedia. Hay Festival 2025. Un espacio para que imaginemos otro mundo.